All right, welcome. We're going on a creative walk today, and this is going to be a very unique topic. We're going to be talking about narratives, narrative psychology, how narratives and stories really connect to who you are. Now, who am I to say? Well, having a background, college education in storytelling as it relates to film industry. That's how I understand story. We have to worry about the biggest stories, which are the stories we tell ourselves, or sometimes even the stories that we actually project. In other words, we may have stories that don't really suit us. They don't support us. And take a nice look around. We have to break down the first part of a story. The first part of our story is the meaning and the coherence. What do I mean by that? Well, your brain is literally a meaning-making machine. And it needs order. Your brain needs order. It doesn't need randomness. It doesn't like uncertainty. Because uncertainty was very relative to fear, the primal aspect of who we are. Stories are designed to reduce uncertainty. That's what they're designed to do. Okay, even the painful ones. That's the thing, is that the painful stories, the painful stories that we tell ourselves, they're kind of like mental shortcuts for us. And a story, a narrative that's holding you back could feel like an old sneaker. Like, it looks good, it feels good. Maybe it's run down, it's a little worn down, but you won't get rid of it because it feels too good. So that's what happens to a lot of our stories in terms of the narratives that we tell ourselves in terms of narrative psychology, right? So your brain is the meaning-making machine. It needs order. It needs certainty, not randomness. And if we take a good look here for a second, is a nice spot to stop, is that the stories were designed as like these brain shortcuts that reduce uncertainty. Even the painful stories feel familiar. They make you feel more secure than the unpredictability. And that's the thing. We don't like unpredictable. We don't like change. We like safety. We like certainty. So here's the first question that I'm going to ask you. And a lot of these questions that I'm going to bring up today on this creative walk, a lot of these questions might, they may trigger you. Understand that my intention is not to trigger you. My intention is to get you to be aware. It's to get you to become more self-aware. So some of these questions require a little bit of contemplation. Like, you may want to contemplate about these thoughts. So ask yourself this. Ask yourself this story. Ask yourself, what story have I made up about who I am based on what happened to me? Okay? Ask yourself that. What story have I made up about who I am based on what happened to me? I want you to just contemplate about that. And maybe write down a title for your story so you can help identify that narrative, understand it. Because here's the thing. We become attached to our stories. That's the exact thing. We become attached to our stories. We become attached to them because of survival. Got it? So most of your stories are formed in early childhood, not all the time, because we live in a narrative-based world. You know, look at Instagram. They use the word stories everywhere, right? Is we live in a narrative-based world, and people buy into all of these narratives all that exist. So a lot of these stories, you're attached to them for survival because they formed in early childhood, and this is before reason and logic started to actually develop. Now, most people have these stories and they take them as truth. They take them as truth. They wouldn't dare question them. And that's where it gets really threatening to the identity. They wouldn't dare question the story because by doing so, it could bring up an uncomfortable truth. Okay? Or if they go away from that idea, they could feel like it's pulling them away from a truth that they've latched onto. It's kind of like if someone believed in Santa Claus and you suddenly came along and said, hey, Santa Claus doesn't exist, you know, their identity would be like a complete paradigm and everything would shift from there, right? That's a way to look at it in that way. Now, we're not saying that these experiences that you had didn't exist or weren't true. That's not the case. But it's not what you have to understand, it's not your experiences, it's the interpretation of your experiences. So these stories, they weren't about truth. They were about your safety. They were about your adaptation. You got to remember, we don't like uncertainty. We like certainty. And as a result of that certainty, we literally will latch on or attach ourselves to a story because it means safety, it means adaptation. Got it? So that's what's really important to understand. That's what it's all about. So we have an attachment to our stories for survival. That's what I want you to break down and understand. So when we start to look at the bigger picture, you ask yourself this question: what identity did I adopt to survive my own environment growing up? Very important. Very important. So you can see that attachment equals survival when you're attached to these stories, and not all of these stories are true. You know, you might have a story where you were bullied as a child. You might have a story about how you were XYZ as a child. You know, you had whatever label we want to slap onto it in modern day. Right? So it's connecting to your self-image. We understand that now that the stories are attached to your identity for survival, we have to understand your self-image. Your personal self-image comes into play. Okay? So your narratives are how you interpret your experiences, not the events or experiences themselves. Got it? So it's not the experiences themselves, it's your interpretation of them. How is that possibly true? The answer is really simple. If you take two people and you put them through the same experience, and it can be the same painful experience, one person can transcend the experience and the other one can't. And this lends itself to personal resilience and a whole host of other factors that are involved. So it's so important to know and understand that your personal self-image is part of the mix. The narratives are how you interpret, not the events themselves. And what people will do is they will repeat these internal stories to build their identity or attach itself to the identity. That's what they do. So even if they're false, by the way, even if they're false, even if the story is completely untrue, they'll still do it. And I want you to ask the question, what part of your identity is just a repeated interpretation? So if you've ever met anyone who, when you meet them, they tell the same story over and over and over again. And I've seen this before. You know, it's like, I can't do that. Why? Because, you know, I'm this type of person and that's all I'll ever be. And you ask them again, hey, what about this idea? What about that idea? I can't do that. Why? Because this is who I am and this is all I'll ever be. So they have these stories. So like I've asked people before, like, hey, why don't you become like an entrepreneur? You know, you can get some help, you can get some support, you can get some training. No, I'm X and this is all I'll ever be. And then you ask them again and they repeat the same line like verbatim. Oh yeah, I'm X and that's all I'll ever be. And here's what you discover. They are stuck in their story. So when you get people that are repeating the same lines over and over again, the same patented line response over and over again, they're deeply, don't bother, like, don't try to convince them of everything. Stop right there. Stop right there immediately. Don't bother. Because they're stuck in their story. And they may not have enough self-awareness. You have to be aware of your story. You have to be aware of what you're going through. And we live in a narrative-based world. The media has a narrative to pitch, right? The whole world has different narratives. Social media is nothing but narrative echo chambers that exist. It's all there. It's all there. And we would be foolish to believe that these stories that exist outside of us don't impact us. And many people say, oh, well, I have free will. I'm like, yeah, that may be. And if you're watching the news, let's say for 8 hours, and you're educating yourself with what else is out there, your brain is absorbing that information. At some point, we'd be a liar to believe that it didn't influence us. Because the word, even today on social media, the word influencer, people that are trying to influence others. So if that wasn't true, we wouldn't be influenced, would we? Right? If that didn't have any weight to it. So what I want to share with you is what part of your identity is just a repeated interpretation. You know, are you telling the same story to 50, 60 people? And you just, every time you meet them, that's the first thing you say. Like, are you doing that? It's a very solid question, right? Very solid question. Pause here for a moment. Enjoy the weather. So now, when it comes to stories, stories reinforce social belonging. So we're tribal creatures, we're social creatures. All right, that's a fact. And these stories, they help us bond. They help us stay accepted. So it's kind of like when people go to healing groups. You know, they go to a healing group, their purpose is to bond. But sometimes that bonding can just attach you even deeper to the old story. You know, you're supposed to go there to transcend the story. You're supposed to go there to heal that, move past the narrative. But what's happening is that socialness. You know, when people go to a healing meeting just to, you know, be social, but not do the work, then it becomes birds of a feather flock together. And no true healing work is being done. So changing your story, when you change your story, that can feel like you're betraying your group or betraying your family. So let me give you another example of this. If you have a couple and they're both hooked up on heroin, let's say, very difficult addiction, and what happens is one of the two gets clean and the other one doesn't. Then the one who's clean, they may feel like they're betraying their relationship. But there's going to be a part of them that's like, you know what, I want to get clean, and if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. Like I'm willing to get clean no matter what. So what happens is the second person could try to sabotage the clean person in order to keep that bond, because they're bonding over an addiction. And they may bond over their stories that they tell. So you have to ask yourself the question, like, am I staying in a false story because it makes others feel comfortable? Am I staying in a false story because it makes other people feel comfortable? You have to ask yourself that. That's so crucial. Because if you feel that you can't break away from the partner because it'll disrupt that dynamic, like, oh, it'll disrupt our whole relationship and it'll disrupt that whole dynamic, then you gotta do what you gotta do. Now, I've also seen this in a case where it was like two people and one was becoming successful and the partner was jealous of them. So the partner would actually self-sabotage the success of the other person. And because why? Maybe there was some kind of secondary gain. In other words, that second person gained something out of it. They've got some kind of payoff out of it. That can be a problem, right? It can be a major issue. So, I'm gonna go ahead and take a walk across the street here. Okay. So, when you're staying in a false story or even a false relationship, and it's really there as a means of self-sabotage, okay, or to make the other person comfortable or to make the other person happy, then it's like you stop your own self-development to appease somebody else. You fall into that people-pleasing trap. Now, you gotta remember, why do these stories kind of happen? Well, they're connected to control and they're connected to certainty. So when it comes to certainty, you know, having that back to survival, it brings us right back to the beginning, is that it's all about survival. People maintain control because they feel they're not going to survive without some control. It threatens their identity, basically. If you don't have control, you feel like you're out of control. And if you feel like you're out of control, then things are uncertain. So if you're feeling uncertain, then you get anxiety. And then you feel like your survival is being threatened, right? That's how it all goes. Like, you know, you can break it all down. So even disempowering stories feel safer than not knowing who you are, right? This is back to that old sneaker mentality. It's an old sneaker, it's all beat up, you're still wearing it, it feels good to wear it, but there's no growth. You're not growing. When you're stuck in your old stories, you're not growing. And there are some really nasty narratives that are out there. Bad ones, really bad. And some of them are perpetuated by social media. We live in a world where overdiagnosis and underdiagnosis of mental health is existing. There's people that are looking at social media and overdiagnosing, and there's people that are looking at social media and they're underdiagnosing. So why does that happen? Because self-awareness is king. You have to have that level of self-awareness to be objective, a level of objectivity as well. You have to be aware, and then you have to have a level of objectivity. See things as they are, not as you are. See relationships as they are, not as you are. And that's what people do, is they have narrative stories that they throw on their partner, they throw on their relationship. It's all there. It's all there in black and white. So you got to remember, these stories provide predictability. They provide control. Even if they hold you back. If they hold you back, you'll hang on to them like that old sneaker because it feels good, right? Discomfort is the true growth. Discomfort is gold. And stepping into that discomfort means you're going to grow. And if you want to grow, it means letting go of old narratives. And some narratives are ingrained so deeply that they're practically cultural. They're cultural narratives that are so deep that it can really disempower a person from any type of development. So I want you to ask this question today. What false sense of control are you clinging to that keeps your story alive? Let me say that again. What false sense of control am I clinging to keep this very story alive? That's so important to know and so important to understand. So I'm going to take a walk back, kind of go this way for a little bit. We'll have some fun here and kind of go a little further with all this good stuff, because quite honestly, there's more. It's like, but wait, there's more. There's more. Let's go. Kind of walk across the street here. All right. All right, feeling good. Feeling good today. So, now we're going to ask some more questions that are literally going to shatter your narratives. Absolutely shatter them. They're probably going to disrupt you in some way. And what I want to share with you is they're not meant to trigger you. They're actually there to promote self-awareness. All kinds of self-awareness. So we're going to go ahead and unpack them. I'm going to walk down this dead end. It looks pretty good here. So these questions are designed to deconstruct your narratives pretty rapidly. All right. And what's going to happen is you could experience some destabilizing feelings. If you're not handling these with awareness and self-compassion, it's going to be very destabilizing. So the first question I want to go into, which is really going to move your mind towards from open, it moves your mind, your thinking. Your mind will become open to contradiction. And that's my job, is to help you dispel some of the contradictions that you actually have, right? So what if, the big question is, this is a question, you may be trying to avoid something in your life because of the narrative, but what if the path you're avoiding, what if that discomfort that you're avoiding is the path that you're supposed to go? What if? It's a question. What if that discomfort you're avoiding is the path that you're supposed to take? That's the question I have for you today. Now, the next question I have is, who would you believe that you are without that story? Who would you believe you are without that story? That's the question I have for you. We're going to walk down here. We're doing a little extra today because I'm taking advantage of that 76-degree weather that we're experiencing, So I'm going to walk across the street. and go down this block. Okay. So who would you be? All right. What would it mean if the opposite of what you believe were true? Right? What if the discomfort that you're avoiding is actually the path that you need to go? And who would you be without that story? Right? Because if that narrative, let's say, vanished right now, what's left of you? What's left of you? People would say, oh, I don't know, like, I think there would be nothing left. And well, that's not true. That's your brain trying to fill in the blank for what's missing, right? Who would you be? It's a great question. You have to remember, coming from an NLP background, asking yourself a better quality question, you get a better quality answer. So that's the whole part. So who would you be without that story? What might happen is your ego might literally collapse just right there. And you have to be very compassionate with yourself. Have that compassion. Please do. Okay. Now, another question to ask is, how do you know that that's true? How do you know that that's true? Like you had an experience and your brain might have tried to fill in the blank or perpetuate an idea. And the question is, how do you know? Like what solid 1000% evidence holds that to be true? That's so crucial. Okay, that's so crucial to ask. How do you know it's true? How do you know? What 1000% evidence? Because if you're not sure if it's true or not, then you could be projecting or trying to fill in the blank with your experience. And it may not be an accurate one. It may not be accurate. Got it? That's the thing. It may not be accurate, and that can be the whole thing that we want to really get to understand here, is that our brains are like Google. They love to fill in the blank. They fill in the blank. So for example, let me give you an example. If I say, why am I so fat? The brain will fill in the blank. The brain will say, well, you had your head in the fridge all week. Your brain will seek evidence to support that and to fill in the actual blank, which becomes a bigger issue. And when you fill in that blank, it may not be the truth. It may not be the actual truth at all. So it's so important for you to get that idea. Another one is, when did you decide that? When you figured that out, at what point in time did you actually decide that that story was true? At what point in time did you figure out that that story was true? Right? Very important. Because what happens, was that your truth, or that was the one you inherited because you didn't know better? Or is that your truth because that's what your parents taught you? And, looking into an authority, you would automatically assume that what your parents taught you was 100% truth all the time, because they're an authority. And because they're an authority, you've adopted that. And that's why I say a lot on this channel, on this podcast channel, I say, every belief you've ever had came from outside of you. You were not born with it. You've adopted and acquired them. It's very important. Okay, so you gotta remember, who benefits if you keep believing that? Like, okay, if you're believing that story, like, who benefits from that? Like, are you somehow benefiting it because it becomes like a social shield or a social crutch, right? It's kind of like someone who says, well, oh, I don't want to quit smoking. Why? You ask them why. Oh, I'll gain weight. Oh, okay, so you'll gain weight, so you're going to have to get some exercise. No, my partner likes me heavy. They want me that way. So you see, there's a secondary gain. They fall into the trap of secondary gain. And they have to be able to maintain that identity because that means the person will still love them. You see? So you see how these beliefs can be destabilizing. So the question I have is, whose world stays safe if you keep playing it small? Like, whose world stays safe if you keep playing it small? If you keep playing it small, like, are you staying safe, or are you actually gonna feel some discomfort and grow? All right. And what are you afraid would happen? Like, what are you afraid of what would happen if you let go of that belief? So if you let go of those stories, stories are connected to beliefs. So if you let go of that story, if you let go of that belief, what are you afraid would happen? Like, if you let go of that belief, like, what are you afraid of? Like, why are you afraid of losing that belief? Because what emotion or truth are you not trying to face? That's the thing. If you're afraid to let go of a story, it could be because you're afraid to face an emotion. Because it's easy to numb ourselves, right? Really, easy. Can you find like a single moment in your life where that belief wasn't true? All right? Let me say that again. Can you find a single moment in your life where that was not true? Okay? Can you find that? Because even for 5 seconds, like, even if there was a point in time, even for 5 seconds of your life where it wasn't true, totally wasn't, there's a tiny gap. And if there's a tiny gap in that, and that means your belief is not a law. In other words, it's not a cold, hard, fast rule. It's not as absolute as you thought it was. So if even for 5 seconds, if that belief wasn't true and there's a tiny gap, then technically that's not a law. That's not an absolute. That's a story. That's a narrative you've been telling yourself. And another question is, who taught you? Who taught you? We become what we're taught. You are what you're taught. You are what you fill into your head all day long. So you have to consider these narratives, these beliefs. You have to be able to consider them. Because quite honestly, there's stories that are extremely disempowering. And when you start to ask these questions, you start to get a pulse on what's going on in the bigger picture. So that's all there is for today. Can't thank you enough for coming with me on this wonderful walk. And I will catch you on the next episode. All right. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because quite honestly, I'm going to be doing a lot of traveling and a lot of workshops about this subject matter. And I have a strong concept of narratives, beliefs, how they're connected to the identity, and how the stories of our world are impacting us. And you got to remember, a lot of the motivations that people have out there, their motivations could be built up on stories that are someone else's story, not your story, but like some false story that was fed to you by some social media influencer. So that's it. Have a great day, and see you in the next video.